Hey everybody, it's Jason with Parallel Reality coming back with you here today with an article from the Daily Signal dated September 2nd. It says, terrifyingly plausible why you're wrong to think civil war can't happen here. So let's go into it. It says, demographer, historian, and author Neil Howe hasn't just coined the term millennial. He's also predicted the future to an eerie degree, and he thinks America's in for a very rough seas ahead. He says a civil war in the U.S. is far more plausible than most people think, and he dismisses the reasons Americans often discount that possibility. In 1997, he published a book with Bill Strauss, The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. In that book, he suggested five catalysts for a major crisis, and 4 of the 5 have already come to pass. And I think there's something too, because Tim Pool has talked about that his book as well, The Fourth Turning. And I guess it's like every 80 years there's basically a major war for the United States. Like we had the Revolutionary War, and then like 80 years later was the Civil War, then 80 years later was World War II, and guess where we are right now from there? You're right, it's 80 years later. So let's go back to where we were. It says, one of our events was a crisis over the debt, which would issue forth in a new Tea Party movement, Howe tells a Daily Signal podcast. He calls it just completely random that we happen to use that phrase, which the Tea Party movement adopted in 2010. The other one was a WMD, or weapon of mass destruction, attack on New York City, Howe says, noting the eerie parallel with September 11th, 2001. The other one was the pandemic, which would be, of course, a certain disease that I'm not going to name because stupid community note will pop up on the video. And the fourth one was Russia invading a former Soviet republic, such as Ukraine. Damn, this guy's accurate as all hell on things. The final potential catalyst, a nullification crisis where one or more of the states would actually nullify federal regulation, which would lead to a new succession movement, Howe says. According to his generational theory, America should expect a major crisis about every 80 to 100 years. Okay, there's what I was saying. And we're due for another rendezvous with destiny, such as the Great Depression and World War II. He calls these periods fourth turnings, as they force society to create a new order in the civic outer world about 40 or 50 years after awakenings drive people inward, seeking order in their spiritual inner worlds. So it says why a civil war is likely, and God forbid that actually happen. Howe notes that our politics have taken on this kind of Manichaean style, if that's how you pronounce that, where the red zone and the blue zone are so mutually exclusive in their sense of themselves, their agenda for the nation's future, that it hardly even matters who's leading the party. Manichaean refers to the tendency to view one side as perfectly good and the other side as perfectly evil, and it traces back to a world religion that arose with the prophet Mani in the 200s AD, which taught that the physical world is evil and the spiritual world is good. All right, never heard of that before. He cites Carl Becker, who wrote an essay in 1941, The Dilemma of Modern Democracy. When most of what you're talking about is the width of sidewalks and the diameter of sewer pipes, just coordination issues, democracy works really well, Howe says. But when you're talking about issues that virtually define who you are, it doesn't work. He said no one is going to accede to a vote count that goes 51% against you. You are not going to give up everything you believe in just because you came up 3 votes short, he explains. Howe says U.S. polarization reached similar levels in the 1770s, the 1850s, and the 1930s. When the Daily Signal noted that American polarization doesn't neatly fall along the lines of a map like the U.S., like in the U.S. Civil War, Howe says the presence of blue cities in red states actually makes conflict more likely. Says our misconception people have is that civil wars require geographically separated places, he notes. This is not true, and take a look at the Spanish Civil War. Right. Says that was brutal. That was a brutal, horrible war, and there was very little geographical. Jesus, I am talking like an idiot. There was very little geographical contiguity about it. It was like honeycombed. The Civil War in China was the same way. And I know more about the Spanish Civil War than the Chinese Civil War, which happened, but right before and right after World War II. Their differences aside, to fight the Japanese, that is the Chinese, in World War II, and then went back to fighting each other. The Spanish Civil War, I remember seeing maps about that and like who was on what side, and it was like, oh, everybody's just kind of everywhere. So it says even in the U.S. Civil War, there were civil wars within states, especially in border states. And actually, your point about blue zone cities within red zone states, or vice versa, is a classic reason why civil wars get touched off and why they are never resolved amicably, Howe says. And I'd like to see a blue state with a red city. Is that even a thing? Anyway, probably is, but like you just don't really hear about that. There's problems for world in U.S. Civil War. It says there are two ways in which we enter his fourth turning very differently from earlier fourth turnings, which are worrying, Howe says. First, he notes, government is so huge going into this fourth turning, while most fourth turnings require government to ramp up in order to face existential threats. Second, he notes the size and global power of our military make the U.S. a central player in world affairs, so a U.S. civil war will have massive ramifications across the globe. As if it requires our forces around the world to stand down for 6 months, the entire world will remake itself, he says. The entire world, for better or worse, depends on our presence to be what it is. Yeah, I didn't really think about it like that everything was everywhere else. I kind of figured, like, if our troops are busy fighting in this country, then even, like, other countries such as China are going to take advantage of that and try to take over parts of this country. That was where my mind was going. So it says, Howe also notes that during a civil war, one side often asks for external help, and this is a rule through all civil wars. Yeah, the Confederacy tried it with Britain during the Civil War, and it didn't exactly help them. So it says, when would the Civil War start? It says, Daily Signal asked Howe why the mini-starter crises of 9/11, the Tea Party movement, that disease right there highlighted, and the Ukraine war did not catch fire and ignite the massive existential crisis that defines a fourth turning. It says the survival of the country has to be at stake, the author says. With regard to World War II, I think FDR made the case. It was very persuasive for the country. We did not want to be the only democracy left on Earth, he explains. This is the way incentives work, Howe says. You've got to feel everything's on the line to push you to do something. Things have come to a head in order to force people to come together and create a new order in society. How exactly that will happen is yet to be determined. And there is, scrolling down, there is the podcast if you actually want to listen to it, and the article is linked below in the description. But yeah, this is kind of frightening, and I might have to actually pick up this book because it sounds really interesting. And again, Tim Pool has talked about it, but now that I'm reading about some of this stuff and what was it, Neo Howe, I might actually have to listen to this podcast as well. Anyway, frightening enough, but hopefully this will not ruin your entire day, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.